I now welcome Mr. John Adams of Adams Economics. Thank you for appearing before the committee today. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the grounds upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may also be made at any other time. Just note the question on notice date again of 3 February 2020. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and capacity in which you appear?
John Adams, Principal Economic Analyst, Adams Economics.
Great. Welcome along. Do you wish to make an opening statement, Mr. Adams?
Yes, Senator. I was going to say, before I do, I should note that I have brought a pack of documents, and you've got a pack, and the rest of the pack of the senators are there at that table. So these are consistent with the instructions that the Secretary gave me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And we will, assuming nobody has any objections, we will accept them. I will ask you to send them through to the Secretariat in electronic version.
Okay.
Obviously that's a decent pile of papers.
Yes.
And we accept you followed instructions, but we would ask you to send them through electronically as well.
No problem, Senator.
Great.
Thank you very much. Okay, so so I'm just going to go to my opening statement. So there are 4 primary reasons why I oppose the government's $10,000 cash payment limit. So number 1, the proposed legislation strikes a fundamental blow to economic freedom in Australia. 2, the proposed legislation will not achieve the government's stated public policy objectives. 3, the Black Economy Task Force and the government have made a series of claims without supporting robust empirical evidence. 4, the proposed legislation is an attempt to entrap Australians into the banking system, which is both anti-competitive and unfair. This entrapment is concerning given the prospect of the Reserve Bank of Australia introducing unconventional monetary policy, in particular negative nominal interest rates. So let me address each of these points in detail. So point 1, economic freedom. The proposed legislation would place significant restrictions on Australians determining their economic affairs and would strike a fundamental blow to the freedom to conduct legal commercial transactions without being tracked by either the government or the banking system. It is for these reasons Germany rejected the introduction of a cash payment limit in 2016 when it was proposed by their government. Moreover, the phenomena of debanking, which was mentioned at the last public hearing, also means that the proposed law may result in the closure of legitimate legal businesses who are denied access to banking services. The other point I'll make is, as we heard from the last witness, the potential regulatory costs that this proposal would impose on corporations and the economy would be significant. And I would argue it would be inconsistent with the government's deregulation agenda. So point 2, failure to achieve public policy objectives. The bill seeks to achieve 2 broad objectives: reducing tax evasion as well as reducing other black economy activity, including money laundering. On the tax evasion question, evidence provided by the Austrian National Bank via a 2017 European Policy Studies report suggests that a cash payment limit did not assist in reducing tax evasion in Austria. Alternatively, evidence from other European countries suggests that a cash payment limit of $10,000 is too high to make a material impact on tax evasion facilitated by cash transactions. On the black economy and money laundering question, evidence from the leading European black economy researcher, Professor Friedrich Schneider from the University of Linz, Austria, is that there is weak empirical evidence that the cash payment limit policies actually reduce the black economy. Moreover, evidence from Austrac to this inquiry is that the proposed law may assist in addressing the money laundering risk involving high-value dealers such as jewellers, art and collectible dealers. However, analysis by the OECD suggests that real estate transactions are the greatest risk of money laundering in Australia, especially funds coming from China. And yet the Parliament has refused to act on recommendations from the OECD to address this risk. Therefore, the proposed law will not address the most significant risks of money laundering in Australia. So point 3, lack of empirical evidence. As highlighted at the 12 December public hearing, the 10,000 threshold by the government was artificially invented by the Black Economy Task Force and was not based on any empirical or statistical analysis. The government has no idea what impact the law would have on compliance with Australia's tax system, and has no idea how much revenue may be generated. And this is a point that was made in the bill's explanatory memorandum. If tax leakage is such a pressing problem for the government, data from the Australian Tax Office suggests that the most obvious source of untapped tax revenue is the 1/3 of large corporations operating in Australia that pay no tax, including foreign multinationals. On the question of money laundering, there is no robust evidence as to how much money laundering, if any, is conducted by so-called high-value dealers, and how the proposed law may reduce or address this risk. Because of what I just said, the evidence suggests that real estate transactions is the greatest source of money laundering risk in Australia. Point 4, unconventional monetary policy. There's an abundance of documentary evidence that the International Monetary Fund and other central bank forums, such as the International Centre for Monetary and Banking Studies, have called for physical cash to be severely restricted or even eliminated in order to facilitate the effective implementation of negative nominal interest rates. These institutions constitute the coordinated global policy effort, which some, including myself, have referred to as the international war on cash. On page 48 of the Black Economy Task Force final report, there's a reference to the writings and commentary of former IMF chief economist Ken Rogoff that moving away from cash could enhance the effectiveness of monetary policy. Ken Rogoff is a leading global advocate of introducing negative nominal interest rates and has argued reducing the availability of cash ahead of the next global recession can hence negative rates in stimulating economic activity. Hence, by virtue of the Black Economy Task Force final report and the technical papers of the IMF and other central bank forums, there is no doubt, and it is not a conspiracy theory, that the proposed law would push Australians into the banking system ahead of negative nominal interest rates becoming a reality in Australia. So, in conclusion, this committee should adopt the same standard set by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd about the need for evidence-based policy. The burden that justifies this legislation rests with the government, and in my view, the government has failed this test. Thank you.
Order. All right, we'll get to questions. Would you like to kick off, Senator McAllister?
Sure. Thanks very much for your submission and for taking the time to appear as a witness, Mr Adams. You mentioned in your remarks just now the phenomenon of debanking, and I don't think that that's discussed in your written submission. What are you referring to?
So the issue of debanking, so that was discussed there was a lot of discussion about that at the last hearing on the 12th of December. So witnesses at that hearing talked about certain legal businesses that were denied banking services because of the banks just didn't want to do business with them. So there was examples of tattoo parlours, pubs, and there are corporations that provide vaping services, etc. And in those instances, the banks basically said, we're not going to give you access to a bank account, we're not going to give you access to an FPOS machine, whatever the case may be. And so the evidence from the last hearing was that if you can't have access to banking services and this law comes in, you can't do business. And basically, this law would put a lot of legal businesses basically out of work.
Thank you. You are not alone in raising the issue of negative nominal interest rates. I suppose the question I have for you is, given that the legislation that's actually before us, notwithstanding your views about what various economists or international commentators may wish to happen, the legislation before us would allow a continuing right to hold and store value in cash. You could take as much money out of the bank as you wanted to and store it, and you could put as much cash in as you wanted to at any time. I do struggle to see how this connection between negative nominal interest rates and the actual measures proposed here is made.
Sure. Okay. So what I would say on that particular point, so there's probably 2 or 3 points to make. So, it has been proposed by certain media organisations that there's no agenda to eliminate cash in terms of the across Australia and across the world. So
just for clarity, who do you believe has proposed that?
Sorry, can
You said it has been proposed by certain media organisations,
Yeah,
and I wanted
yeah.
to know who you.
Sure. So
who
the
you
Australian
identify.
Financial Review wrote an article about my commentary on this particular legislation and suggested I was involved in conspiracy theory. So,
I see.
so part of the reason why I've brought all these documents is to demonstrate that there is a whole host of international documentation, and again, it's referred to in the Black Economy Task Force that there's a move by the Morrison government to reduce or eliminate cash in the Australian economy that would actually enhance monetary policy. So the question is, well, what are they wanting to enhance? How would this be more effective? It's around negative interest rates. So the question then becomes is, well, how does this specific law, impact that particular question? So I would argue in a couple of ways. The first one is that if negative interest rates were to come in, whether, and it was in my supplementary submission, so we have seen at least one bank so far in Germany where it doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank, you'll be paid a fee to hold money in the bank. So if you withdraw your money out of the bank to hold it, then if you do want to engage in a transaction above 10,000, you must go to the banking system and you're going to be in charge and certain fee. So that fee, whatever the case may be, I mean that could be quite significant. So the other point I would make is that I have heard quite a few stories across Australia in the last 4 months. It is getting increasingly more difficult for Australians to withdraw large volumes of cash out of the banking system. So, and I'm happy to give you a couple of examples. So one example is, one of the things I do separate to consulting is I'm involved in the gold and silver business. We had one client, 80 years old, wanted to buy $900,000 worth of precious metals. Our company policy that I work for was that they had to provide a deposit of $100,000, and then they had to pay the balance when the goods were delivered. So they go to the bank, get the $100,000, and they give it to the company. They go back to the bank and say, we want to withdraw $800,000, which is the balance of our account. The manager of the branch basically said that he has a duty of care to ensure that this 80-year-old Australian knows what he's doing. And he made the determination that he didn't know what he was doing, and basically said, we're not going to give you your money. So basically, this 80-year-old basically was told by the bank, you will not have access to your money, and therefore, you have to leave now. So 3 months on, he still can't get access to his money. He's had lawyers involved. He's gone to a whole host of other people. So there are clear examples, and there are people who have done at $20,000, $50,000. I mean, banks are putting more restrictions and making it harder for people to withdraw money out of the banking system. So people could have money in the bank, a negative interest rate come in, and then you want to try to get money at the bank. It is becoming harder to actually, in terms of getting money out. And then if you get it out, well, how can you use it in such a way that is legal, and you're not going to be basically tracked by the government or in terms of the banking system? So the other point is, and obviously with the first witness that came today, Senator Patrick referred to the rules. So under the rules, there is an exemption. So, and this is the Section 8 of the rules basically makes it exempt that if you are reporting under the anti-money laundering law, you're exempt from this law. Now, who does that cover? That covers the banks. So as the rules are stated now, if you have money in the bank, you can still deposit, you can still withdraw, and that's legal. But it's an exemption. And if that exemption is removed by the Assistant Treasurer, then it actually becomes illegal to actually withdraw or deposit money in the bank. So
if I may stop you there for clarity, Mr. Adams, your objection that you're stating here in this third point is not the exemption, but the fact that it is contained in subordinate legislation, not in the primary legislation.
Well, yeah.
And provides significant discretion to the government of the day.
Yeah, yes. So obviously you'd be aware that the Scrutiny of Bills Committee basically said that these exemptions should be in the primary legislation, not in the rules. But technically speaking, the bill itself says that all transactions in Australia above 10,000 can't be done in cash, and then there are certain exemptions. So if you pass the legislation and exclude the rules, taking money in the bank is illegal, basically in cash. But then, and then obviously, and so obviously one of the big concerns is if we did have some sort of financial crisis, if we did have some sort of run on the banks, and if you look at, for example, you've got massive capital controls in Lebanon now, you've had massive capital controls in Greece in 2012, and in terms of Cyprus as well. If we did have a severe financial crisis, one of the big concerns is that this law, if the exemption is removed, Section 8 of the rules, basically you can't take money at the bank. So that's a direct consequence of this legislation. But
Sorry, just to stop you there. I mean, we may as well you've got a lot of ideas, so we may as well explore them in an orderly way. But your proposition is a fear that in the event of a financial crisis, a government might use the latitude inherent in the legislation before us to intervene in ways that you don't agree with in the economy. Is that, I'm not...
What I'm saying is that legal avenue is possible.
Thank you. Yeah. That's probably all for me, Chair. Thank you.
Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much. I was interested in your submission. You question the efficacy of the government's underlying economics in terms of suggesting that the black economy is growing. Can you just elaborate on that, please?
Sure. So the Black Economy Task Force came to the view that the black economy in Australia over the last few years, it has been increasing. Now, the leading international expert on the black economy, Professor Schneider from Austria, he has, and so one of the papers that's in the pack is actually his analysis, which was published at the International Monetary Fund, is to suggest that over the last 20 to 25 years, the black economy has actually been shrinking in Australia. It has not been growing. So we have Australian task force saying it's growing. One of the leading international experts say no, the black economy in Australia, it is actually shrinking. And if you go to the size of the black economy in 2015, according to Professor Schneider's estimates, the Australian black economy, it was the fifth smallest in the basically in the OECD. So
Clarify, does Professor Schneider say it's shrinking as a percentage of the economy or shrinking in absolute terms?
In terms of GDP. So yeah, yeah. So on this fundamental premise, there's a dispute in terms of what's really happening with the black economy. Is it getting worse, or is it actually getting better over time? And obviously one of the points I would make is that when Peter Costello was treasurer and they introduced the GST, one of the propositions was that GST would reduce the black economy. It's fair to say that whether it's been under Labor or the coalition, there's been a series of measures to address the black economy over the last 20 years, and so. It would make sense to me that the black economy has been shrinking, particularly because we've seen a transition away from cash payments to the digital economy, and this is obviously the evidence of the Treasury and the RBA. So we have seen the shift, and if we've seen the shift, it would make sense, particularly because of the anti-money laundering requirements by the reporting requirements by the banks. We would see a shrink in terms of the size of the black economy.
Okay. Sticking with the theme on the black economy, you say that there are two objectives that the government is seeking from this bill. One is to look at tax evasion, and the other to look at the black economy. So that's just the way in which the black economy uses cash transactions to conduct business. And I just wonder, in introducing these laws, these people that are acting unlawfully probably won't be persuaded by this new law anyway.
No. So the definition of a criminal is someone who doesn't follow the law. So if you're not going to follow the law, why would you follow it this time?
I was just looking at one of the exemptions in the rules are a payment solely made as a gift. Aren't all black economy payments gifts?
Potentially.
Yeah, it really goes to the effectiveness of whether or not this bill will achieve those particular aims, and I wonder, in your view, is there enough evidence? Is there any evidence strong evidence that says this will cause a change in the conduct in the black economy?
No. The thing is that the government, in my view, hasn't provided enough evidence to convince me that this will actually address those two primary objectives on tax evasion and in terms of money laundering. And so obviously this European Policy Studies report, and it's interesting, when the Uniting Church testified on the 12th of December, I mean, they cherry-picked their quotes, but there is definitely a quote in this report, which is in this pack, where the Austrians have said, we have a high volume of cash transactions in our economy, and this cash payment limit, which in Austria is lower than 10,000 euros, it didn't actually help in terms of tax evasion. And the other point I'll probably make is, when you look at the testimony from the Law Council of Australia, very hard to secure a criminal prosecution in terms of the law. So on the tax question, I mean, yeah, the international experts. So again, I don't want to be here today making claims. I want to present the best evidence that I've come across that says to me that you won't achieve that.
It just says, in your statement, you said that the government hasn't provided any convincing evidence.
Correct.
But is there other evidence available outside of government that suggests that this would be effective?
No. The thing is that, so the Austrians said didn't help. I mean, there are some governments in Europe who have said that this potentially could help, but if it's going to help, it's got to be way lower than
How many countries has this sort of legislation been implemented in?
Thing is, like, so I think if you look at the European Policy Studies report, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, at least 15 to 20 countries in Europe have actually implemented it.
And is there any empirical data from those jurisdictions that say this is what happened before and this is what happened after? No. So one of the quotes from Professor Snyder is that there is, quote, weak empirical evidence that this will actually deal with tax evasion or the black economy. So if Professor Snyder, who's been writing leading papers on this, can't see the evidence, I would suggest there's not a convincing catalogue of evidence that would prove that by implementing this, the government will actually achieve the objectives that the legislation says it's going to achieve. So you say little positive outcome for the government. We clearly understand there's an imposition for businesses, and indeed, as you state, there's a restriction on the freedom of people to act lawfully within the economy created by this bill. That would be your summary, that the benefits are highly questionable and the disadvantages are not questionable.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Kitching.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your time today, Mr. Adams. Could I ask you just to expand on the point in your first submission that revolved around the real estate industry and the tackling of the black market economy in that, which isn't being addressed?
So in the pack, there is a report from the OECD. So the OECD has said that one of the greatest risks, and so there have been other voices in Australia who has also made this point, that one of the greatest risks of money laundering in Australia is actually in terms of real estate. So I would say that this is an important point on two fronts. One is AUSTRAC's testimony on the 12th of December was that this law will not actually address real estate transactions. This law will actually focus on high value dealers. And so one of the frustrations of the OECD and a whole host of other stakeholders across Australia is that whether it's the ALP or whether it's the coalition, neither government has actually gone to the step of expanding the anti-money laundering reporting framework to include real estate agents, lawyers and accountants. So the greatest risk of money laundering, there is a way forward that the OECD and others have suggested to address that risk. This law is not that way. The way they have suggested is to expand the anti-money laundering framework. And so when I was looking at the Parliament House website last year, there is a law, and I don't think it's passed yet, there is a law that I think Minister Dutton introduced, which was to actually reform the anti-money laundering regime, and real estate agents in particular were not captured under that proposed law by the government. So I would argue is that if the Parliament is serious around money laundering, the OECD has provided a pathway forward, and both sides of politics of the major parties have not actually done anything to address that particular risk.
Just so I'm clear, this is the paper implementing the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention Phase 4 report?
Yeah, that is the report, yes.
Lovely, thank you. You also listed a number of key concerns, and one of them was around the government seeking to infringe on the rights of individual Australians. Are you aware that the Victorian Liberal State Council earlier this week 95% supported opposing this legislation?
The person who moved the motion is sitting in the gallery today.
Well, I've got a copy of the.
You're quoting the Liberal Party.
I've got a copy of the resolution, and I'm happy to read it.
more often.
I'm happy to read it.
You should listen to them
So,
more often.
that this state council calls on the federal government to reaffirm its commitment to individual freedom and free enterprise by withdrawing the currency restrictions on the use of Cash Bill 2019. The federal government has announced that it will introduce a bill, Currency Restrictions on the Use of Cash Bill 2019, to ban cash transactions between entities above an arbitrary threshold of $10,000, which can be changed if or when required. Banning cash is an illiberal policy that erodes civil liberties and conflicts with our party's fundamental principles of individual freedom and free enterprise. The legislation forces people into private banks to transact, purportedly to curb crime, which is a state issue. This bill will actually expose individuals to prosecution and other objectionable government policy, including negative interest rates and deposit bail-in. And they've noted that the federal minister responsible is the Treasurer. I understand both the Treasurer and the Assistant Treasurer were present at the State Council, but didn't remain for the vote. But it was passed by 95%.
Correct. Yes, so I personally was not there, but the person who moved the motion is sitting in the gallery today, so I'm fully aware of that issue. The other point I would make, and perhaps Senator Patrick and you and Senator McAllister would not know, is I am actually a former coalition Senate advisor.
I think that's in the Aaron Patrick article.
Yes. So when Senator Brockman was working as an advisor, I was working as an advisor in 2012-13, and what I would say is, and it's very interesting in terms of the last witness. So my role when I was a coalition advisor was working on the coalition's deregulation policy. So when the Rudd government implemented a deregulation agenda, I was working as a Commonwealth public servant in the Department of Finance, working on deregulation as a bureaucrat, and then I had the opportunity to go help the coalition formulate a policy. And what I would say is that this policy is completely inconsistent with the thinking in terms of how to deregulate an economy and to actually to promote not only economic freedom, but in terms of sort of robust economic outcomes. So.
Cost of business, it appears, as well.
Of course, absolutely. And Senator Patrick, what I would say on that is that I find it interesting that the government hasn't published a regulatory impact statement about this particular law, because it's very interesting with the last witness. They can't quantify the cost, and the cost is quite significant. And I would say that the Black Economy Task Force wasn't necessarily thinking that travel agents were a big source of Black economy activity. So the fact that there is no regulatory impact statement, my view is the government hasn't done its homework on this. They've come up with a bit of a rush law, quite ill-considered, a lot of negative impacts, not a lot of benefits, the government is trying to push this through. One of the risks is, so there's quite a few Australians who are aware of this law. There's millions of Australians who have no idea that the Parliament's considering this law. And so if this law does pass and millions of Australians do find out that this is now the law, I would say that the economic but also the political repercussions of this would be more significant than what potentially Parliament is thinking at the moment.
I think one of the attendees at the Victorian Liberal Council meeting said, "I have a simple message for the Treasurer and the Assistant Treasurer, get out of my wallet." And do you think...
I think we do need to return to the bill, please, Senator Kitching.
Well, I think I think that it's interesting philosophically about why a party that purports to stand for individual freedoms would impose something on Australians, which basically is around legal tender. And I was going to ask Mr. Adams if he could very briefly give a philosophical response to why he, and I think you've partly answered that in your last response.
Sure. I mean, look, so I've said it on the public record previously, happy to say it again. So at the time I worked for Senator Sinodinos in 2012-13, I was a member of the Liberal Party. In 2016, I quit the Liberal Party. One of the reasons why I've quit the Liberal Party is because I hold a set of philosophical beliefs my view is that the coalition has walked away from in terms of those core beliefs, and so I think the vote at the Victorian State Liberal Council was a reflection of their distress that the cabinet and some of these ministers are pursuing policies for particular vested interests, and so I would say that particularly the banking system, the banking industry, are very supportive of this particular measure, and so when the coalition is pushing the interests of certain industries and not holding firm to their core foundational beliefs, that's causing significant distress in the Liberal Party, and it's actually one of the core reasons why I decided to walk away from the Liberal Party.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Is this a supplementary? That's right. You mentioned no regulatory impact statement. Being a bureaucrat, what's the threshold for making a regulatory impact statement, or rather, why would this have been carved out in that respect?
No. The thing is that so when I worked in the Department of Finance in 2008, 9, 10. I think under the Labor government, it was only, so anything that was of material nature had to have a regulatory impact statement. Now, at the time, Treasury had a very poor compliance record. Now, I would argue that this law has a huge regulatory impact, that Treasury should have produced a regulatory impact statement, and if they haven't, I suspect they haven't complied with the government's own regulatory. So, in terms of,
I'll ask them. I was just wondering if you'd point me to the right place that which sets the threshold for it, such that I can ask them that question.
So I'm happy to take that on notice and come back to you with a written response.
If you don't know, that's fine.
But what do you think about the general proposition that cash is a declining part of the economy anyway, and people are voting with their behaviour?
So that I'm glad you asked that question, Senator, because I think that's one of the core questions. So we are seeing, and so this is consistent with the evidence from the RBA and Treasury. We've seen over the last decade a movement away from cash. Although that movement away from cash isn't particularly universal. There are other, particularly places in Europe where cash is still being heavily used. Germany, 60% of transactions are still in cash. In terms of Austria, high level of cash usage as well.
Is that cultural or regulatory?
No. Look, so I think the evidence from the European Policy Studies report is that is cultural. So one of the concerns I have is that when negative interest rates do come into Australia, we're going to see a reversal in the trend on the demand for cash. So we're going to see the demand for physical cash go up. And so the government's proposition on this law is that the demand for physical cash going forward is going to go down once negative interest rates come in, and I'm convinced they will. The demand for cash will go up, and why? Because people are not going to want to pay the impost that they will have to pay if they keep their money in terms of the bank. And so, one of the key points is that the IMF, and this is again in these papers, that they've said that if we have a recession or a financial crisis, etc., we will have to, to stabilise the economy, interest rates will have to be cut between 3 to 6%. So interest rates, official policy rates at the moment is 0.75. So if the IMF is saying you have to cut between 3 to 6, well, where's interest rates going to go? We're talking anywhere between -2 to -5. And so this is one of the papers that the IMF published last year, is to suggest that interest rates are likely to go in the next recession anywhere between -2 to -5. Now, if that was the case, ordinary Australians will have to give up a certain proportion of their deposits to the banks, because interest rates, how it works is negative interest rates. The central bank imposes a negative charge on reserves held by the commercial banks. The commercial banks deposit a portion of the reserves into the central bank. The central bank charges those reserves with a negative interest rate charge. The banks then have to make up that cost, and so far, particularly in Denmark and Germany, they are charging customers with that. So if policy rates went severely negative, you're going to see a whole bunch of Australians say, "Oh, I don't want to pay this to the banks. I want to take my money out of the banks." The demand for physical cash go up, and then this law is going to trap these people, because once this law comes in, then it's like you may have $100,000, but you are limited in terms of what you can actually do with that money. So that's a key point that the committee has to consider is, you can look at what the demand for cash is today, but what is the demand for cash going to be in the next 2 or 3 years? It's going to actually be higher because of these negative interest rates.
Alrighty. There being no further questions, Mr. Adams, we thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
And on that, and on that basis, we will suspend until 11:15.